My name is Howard J. Ehrlich. I was born in a log cabin in Brooklyn, New York. I came to anarchism in a strange way. I was at a peace rally when a group of people waving a black flag ran up to the lectern, yelled some things that were incomprehensible, and left. And I turned to the person I was with and I said, "What was that?" He said, "Those were the anarchists." I said, "Who are they?" And he said, "You mean you don't know Marx and Bakunin?" Marx and Bakunin? I was embarrassed. I said, "No, I didn't know. I never heard of Bakunin." And he said, "Their correspondence is famous." And so I ran to the library to look for the Marx and Bakunin correspondence, and there wasn't any. But in the process, I had read an awful lot of anarchism and decided, hey, there was something to this. And that's sort of how I came to anarchism.
Great.
As an anarchist, I think my major work has been, in the later years, I'm in my later years, a writer and an editor. I've edited several anthologies and am the editor of the magazine of social anarchism. Earlier, I was strongly involved in the peace movement, the Vietnam War. I was a regional traveling organizer for a while. And I helped organize what was the national organization called the New University Conference, one of the more anonymous but really powerful anti-war organizations. That's all I think I wanted. That wasn't very articulate.
Oh, that's fine. We also can edit.
Add one more thing.
Okay, just a second. The mic, camera. Okay.
I have, in my work as an anarchist, never been able to forget, nor did I want to, that I trained as a sociologist and social psychologist. And the reason why I mention that is that no matter what I look at from a political standpoint, I'm also looking at as a social scientist. And so I have a very different view, I think, of both social science and anarchism. The best way I can talk about combining an anarchist perspective with a social science perspective is to talk about what it is I think a radical social scientist ought to be doing. I think we can still go about the process of testing hypotheses and building theories, but we have to understand that we're building theories for a reason, and that reason is to build a new and better society. And so as a sociologist, what I want to do is to test propositions that confirm or disconfirm our way about building a new society. We compiled Reinventing Anarchy as a means of introducing people to the various dimensions of anarchism. And I think we did a good job. We sold several thousand copies of the book. But to me, the thing that was and is most intriguing is about 10 years later we decided to put out a new edition, and not to use things that were not to use articles that were more than 10 years old, so that it would still be quite contemporary. In fact, 80% of the second anthology was new. But the interesting thing about it from a political standpoint is that they were very different books. That the Reinventing Anarchy Again, which we called it, was deadly serious, whereas reinventing anarchy was fun. That if you look at the two books side by side, you'd see that there were all these cartoons, flyers, clever little pieces. If you look at Reinventing Anarchy again, the humor was gone, and it reflected the times. The first in the late '60s, and the second 10 years later, and anarchism couldn't escape the change in the times, from the anti-war activities, the mass organizations like SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, the New University Conference, Science for the People. All of these came together with great humor and good propaganda. Subsequently, the propaganda is still there, if you want to call it, which I think we can, but the humor isn't. And I felt there was nothing we could do about it. We were trying to represent the field, and that's the way it stood. When I would tell people who asked, what is anarchism, they'd often laugh. How can you be an anarchist? Anarchists have no organization, and you're one of the more organized people I know. And I tried to tell them that one of the things about anarchism is that it is a theory of organization. In fact, I argue that anarchism is a theory of organization, a theory of radical social change, and a personal philosophy. And people have a great deal of difficulty comprehending that. In fact, I'll tell you a story. I was doing some contract research on grants with the National Endowment for the Humanities in the state of Maryland. And the head of the office had found out that I was an anarchist. And she asked what it was, and I gave her a copy of the magazine. About a month later, I hadn't heard anything about it. I asked her assistant, what about the magazine? And she said, oh, so-and-so never read it. And it turned out that she started to read it the day I gave it to her on the bus, and decided that people were staring at her. So she put it away. And every time she took it out, she had this delusion that people were staring at her. Finally, she hid it in her house, because she was sure her husband would find it and he would be very angry. And so she returned it to me via her assistant without ever reading it. And I've had that similar reaction over the years. Of course, people always want to joke about anarchism and organization. And when they see that I'm serious about it, they usually terminate the conversation.
Okay.
I think it's important to look at the various components of this ideology, this set of beliefs we call anarchism. And one is to understand that it's a way of life. That anarchism is a way of life. It's a way in which we deal with people, in terms of how we live, in terms of violence and nonviolence, in terms of stop that. Let me start that over. I believe that I have to, and any anarchist has to, put together anarchism as a way of life, understand it as a theory of organization. And as a theory of organization, people often have a great deal of difficulty with it because the stereotype of anarchism is, of course, chaos, not to mention violence. So when you begin to talk to someone who is naive to the area, those are the two things that come up. How can you be serious given the violence that anarchists have manifest? And often they'll point to Berkman and Goldman, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. Berkman, who thought by assassinating one of the big capitalists of the day that this would motivate people to join in the anti-capitalist movement. He was, of course, mistaken. This was not the way to go. Then there was the anarchist who shot McKinley. And so these remain. These are sort of the iconic symbols of anarchism, iconic from the standpoint of people who are rejecting the idea. When I talk about anarchism as a theory of organization, I let people know that hierarchy and the absence of hierarchy are theories of organization themselves, and that nobody laughs when you talk about when you talk about organization from an anarchist standpoint, but they simply can't conceive of a group, of an organization, of a city being run on non-hierarchical principles. Note in the recent Egyptian struggle, none of the commentators talked about this. None of the commentators, except maybe Al Jazeera, I'm not sure about them, none of them talked about this as an anarchist-like uprising. Here was a spontaneous uprising. It was an uprising that tried to maintain a nonviolent perspective. But anarchism was written out of the dialogue. I maintain that the central concept of anarchist theory is power. That we need to understand that power is manifest in many different ways. For example, class, gender, policing, violence, and so on. That all of these are the oppression of women, oppression of persons by class. These are ways of maintaining power and dominance over them. And that to understand the different theories of anarchism, you have to understand the way in which power gets played out. And what happens is that a lot of anarchists focus on the dimensions like class and gender, to the, I think, mistake of ignoring the higher order construct, namely power. If we believe that people are truly equal, then we need a world that reflects that reflects egalitarianism. I know of no political ideology that does this other than anarchism. People will talk about democracy, but typically democracy goes only so far. We need an anarchist world because we won't, I don't think we'll survive, both from a political and economic or ecological standpoint. unless we can deal with each other in a manner that recognizes our that recognizes ourselves as being equal. And being equal means that we need to build organizations which are non-hierarchical. Hierarchy is a form of manifestation of power. And the worst form of hierarchy is, of course, bureaucracies. You know, anarchism probably had some of its roots in democratic theory. But if you're going to have a society in which a minority, in which a majority can determine the relations of people and institutions, that means that somebody's going to be on top and somebody's going to be on the bottom. And that is antithetical to the notions of anarchism. Whether we're talking about the economy and building a participatory economy as opposed to building a capitalist economy, whether we're talking about voting for somebody for political office as opposed to a collective decision and collective decision making. Democracy simply is still a way of maintaining power and hierarchy. We need to look at the mechanisms by which people maintain power and control over others. I think that possibly the most violent institutional form is a bureaucracy. It's violent because it legitimates hierarchy. It's violent because it tells people that they're not responsible for their actions. That is to say, one acts in a bureaucracy according to the rules of the bureaucracy. But the rules of bureaucracy are ones which say, listen, you're not accountable for this. This is the way we do things. So one of the things that happens is that people get socialized into actions and mechanisms which maintain the power base in the society. Now, it also comes about with respect to maintaining levels of discrimination, particularly where race and ethnicity and gender are involved. Discrimination, I would say, and I've tried to persuade my sociological colleagues, discrimination is the underlying basis of ethnoviolence. I'll stop there.
Something like anarchism and violence question.
I think that when it comes to violence, anarchists are divided. And I think that's okay. We don't have all the answers. What we need, I think, as we build an anarchist theory is a sketch. Let's not pretend that we have a full-blown theory. We have a sketch of a theory. Sooner or later, as a population engages in insurrectionary activities, they move, in some cases, to violence. But was the Egyptian revolution we just witnessed violent? What many people are pointing to it as a non-violent revolution, but both the police, the military, and certainly the protesters were doing things that were violent. So I say what we need to do is to minimize as much as we can the exercise of violence, and understand that that has to be the absolute last resort. We can't build a peaceable society on the basis of a violent revolution. I just don't think that can happen. On the other hand, how we go about building a society of people at peace is something that we have to work at, I think, very hard. Well, the first principle, I think, for anarchists is a principle of egalitarianism. We have to be able to build institutions in which hierarchy and the maldistribution of power are central to organizing. I think that we need to learn how to live and work collectively, and that collective work is one of the principles that is subsumed under power. That is, once we can minimize, reduce, do away with power differentials, I think we can live a different kind of life. I think, and excuse me if I'm just sort of random, but this is a tough question. I think we need to be able to deal with our technology differently. That is to say, we need to build, as Murray Bookchin put it, a liberatory technology. So, for example, wind power or solar may be construed as a liberatory technology, whereas fossil fuel burning plants require a high degree of concentration of dealing with resources which won't last, oil, coal, for example, particularly oil, and nuclear power, which is now being pushed once again, even at the level of the presidency of the United States. Nuclear power is a centralizing form of energy, so we need to work on that. We need to work on dealing economically and to developing a kind of participatory economics in which the people who are affected by economic decisions have a legitimate role in helping to make those decisions. We probably need to work hard at building egalitarian institutions. I don't think I have a poster upstairs, I don't have it down here, that says there can't be a revolution without women, or as Mao put it, quoting Mao in an anarchist documentary, as Mao put it, women hold up half the sky. I think we need to be able to deal with race and ethnicity in a manner that we haven't yet been able to do.
Just a second.
often when talking about race, ethnicity, and so on, people say, that's the way we were born. That prejudice is an inborn characteristic. And I think they say that, and this is where social science and anarchism intersect. I think they say that because children learn so early the basic dimensions of race and ethnicity that by the age of 3, children in most Western societies already have learned some of the basic stereotypes. So it comes so early, it deludes us into thinking that it is almost instinctive. And of course, at one time it was believed to be instinctive. Now it's a little iffy. How it impacts on anarchism particularly is the fact that even as anarchists, we can't escape the fact that we live in a racist society. And so everything we do is colored by the fact that at the one time we act out a stereotype, and at another time we act out with due diligence an egalitarian social form. We have to work at, and we have to work at fighting against racism, prejudice, bigotry, however you want to label it. And I think that one of the ways we do it, and I guess in part this is a principle of anarchist organization, we need to have systems of internal education. That is, for an anarchist organization to really survive, they've got to be able to come together at regular intervals and literally have not necessarily an alternative school, although that would be great, but literally have a regular time and place in the everyday activities of the organization in which one acts out in an egalitarian, non-racist, non-sexist manner. And I think that the failure of many groups, including anarchist groups, to maintain themselves together is the fact that they have not been able to educate themselves, if you will, as to the basic principles of anarchism. Take, for example, something like a food co-op. You can bring people together, and anarchists have been involved in food co-ops and other alternative institutions. You can bring people together and have them purchase food more cheaply. You can bring people together and have them purchase more nutritious food. But unless there is also an understanding of the whole process of the growing of food, of the processing of food, of the way in which food is distributed around the world, that unless you can have that, there's no politics here. And in that regard, anarchists have to maintain their politics up front. There are many different styles of anarchism. And I don't think that's bad. I would like to see greater cooperation than there is, but for example, the class war anarchists versus the anarchist syndicalists versus the social anarchists and so on. All these are different modes of expression which are really trying to do the same thing, namely to build a society based on equality. It seems to me many different paths to an anarchist community. As long as we don't allow ourselves to fight with each other because we've chosen a different path. And I think there's been a little bit of that and coming from places where they should have known better. That is to say, I don't see why I can't live with an anarchist syndicalist, but I know they're wrong. Yeah, I don't see why I can't live with a class war anarchist, but I think they're too Marxist. And so I have objections to all but my own variety of social anarchism, which I think is the right path to take. But I certainly will not allow that to assault anarchists who want to walk on a different path.
Can you maybe, and not anarcho-syndicalism or class struggle anarchism?
I'm not exactly sure where the term social anarchism originated. I think it comes from an Italian work by Giovanni Baldelli in a book entitled Social Anarchism. We selected the name social anarchism. We spent a lot of time when we were starting up our magazine, and we had several choices. One was we thought of calling it broccoli. I'm serious. We thought of calling it broccoli because nobody would know what that meant, and that would give us the opening to talk about this. We thought of calling ourselves White Rose because there was a collective at that time in Cambridge called the Black Rose, and a White Rose in Germany that we decided, no, there were already too many roses there. We had some other titles in mind, but we chose social anarchism one time because it confused people. That is, the notion of social anarchism went against the stereotype of anarchism as violent and chaotic. And we figured that might make people talk, and it did. It does. To this day, when I tell people I'm a social anarchist, they're ready to talk about it, I'm assuming they don't walk away giggling. I don't know of when people started using social anarchism, since we adopted it sort of from Baldelli. And this was, 1978, I think. And then when Murray Bookchin came out with his book on social anarchism, it had nothing really to do with social anarchism, but it popularized among anarchists, it popularized the term. One of the central mechanisms we have not yet talked about is that of the alternative institution. By an alternative institution, I mean some institution that deals with the vital resource, that operates under principles of of non-hierarchy, anti-authoritarianism, if you will, that has a process of internal education, and that these put together participatory decision making on all of the issues that are important to the group you're working with, and in opposition to the straight, narrow capitalist group, presumably you're opposed to. Put them all together and you have an entirely different form of organization. And it's that organization that I think is one of the central to building a revolutionary transfer culture. That is, a transfer culture in the sense of raising the question, how do we get from here to there? And building alternative institutions, I argue, is one of those ways that we get from here to there.
Great.
The response to critics of anarchism who believe that somehow or other hierarchy and violence are part of human nature. The response is twofold. One is that there's no evidence for that. That is to say, anything that you can point to and say this is part of human nature, I can point to its contradiction. So that human nature becomes an ideological tool. I can attack you because you're violating principles of human nature, and you can attack me because I don't know what I'm talking about when I say human nature is basically good. That human nature is a function of the way in which we raise our children. It's a function of the way in which we treat each other. And it's a level of abstraction I hate to get caught up in.
Okay, well...
Well, I don't want to answer a question about how optimistic or pessimistic I am, because it depends on what day it is. But I also am willing to say that I don't want to think in terms of building a world on anarchist principles. I'd like to start out by thinking of building an alternative institutions, by building a community, by building a network of workers in the same area. In other words, I want something more modest as a goal than the world in which everybody is wonderful. And furthermore, I have a feeling that if we were able to build an anarchist community, we would discover all kinds of things that we didn't think of before. And so we would still be building an anarchist community, that in fact maybe there's no end to that.